Hi, I'm Erin. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today I'm sharing my January reading wrap up. To get started, I wanted to just share a few stats because I found that my stats for this month were really interesting considering my reading trends for the past decade or so. So those of you who have been watching my videos for the last few weeks since I joined Booktube might know that for the last 10 plus years, I've been reading 85 to 95% nonfiction, and that recently I've been jumping back into fiction. And one of the stats that I found very amusing this month was that of all the books I read in January, I read 16 books. 13% of them were nonfiction and 87% were fiction. So I've been enjoying jumping back into fiction and trying out some different genres, as you'll see. The first book I finished reading in the month of January was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. I listened to this one on audiobook primarily, and I ended up giving it 2.5 stars rounded up to 3 on Goodreads. And what I liked about it was that it had a nice warmth to the tone of the writing, and it really helped draw you in. I loved the character Marcellus, who is an octopus, and the scenes written from his point of view were my favorite. I loved seeing him interact with Tova. Because we got to hear from Marcellus's point of view, I felt like the story had a unique charm to it that brought in, and I really enjoyed that. I did feel, though, that there were several characters and subplots and scenes in the story that didn't really add a whole lot to the actual plot or story of the book, and I felt that the book could have been a stronger read, a stronger story, if those subplots had been a little bit more developed, a little bit more connected to the main storyline in a way that drew me in a little more. As it was, I just wasn't as interested in them, and I found myself wanting to skip through some of them to get back to the main story. And so for me, they ended up being more of a distraction than complementary elements of the story. So because of that, my rating was kind of fair to middling, and I didn't love the whole book, but I did really enjoy the scenes particularly told from Marcellus's point of view, or that showed Tova and Marcellus interacting with each other. The second book I read in January was The Secret of the Old Clock by Carolyn Keene. Carolyn Keene is a pseudonym that a group of writers who wrote the Nancy Drew books all wrote under. I'm hoping to read all 56 of the original books this year. When I was young, these books were some of the ones that really got me into reading and helped me enjoy reading. I used to stay up late when I was a kid reading Nancy Drew books when I was supposed to be sleeping. And so returning to them has just been very nostalgic thus far. I've read 2 so far. The first is The Secret of the Old Clock, which is the first book in this series. And I ended up giving this one 5 stars, primarily because it was just so nostalgic to dive back into this world. Something I really love about the Nancy Drew books is that they're originally written and published in the 1930s, and they do kind of carry an air of the 1930s in the stories that's very charming and endearing, but they also feel very timeless in another way as you're reading them. My sister once told me that she doesn't like Nancy Drew because Nancy is too perfect, and so when she was a kid she just couldn't get into the books, and I think that's a fair criticism. Nancy is very much perfect in the stories, but I think that appealed to me and kind of contributed to the escapism and the mystery and helped me focus more on the problems she was solving. Some stories are more character driven and have more to do with the character's story arc throughout the stories, but with Nancy, she's kind of just constant. She's always the same, and the plot is way more focused on the mystery she's trying to solve, and her character doesn't really develop a whole lot throughout the original 56 books. So it's a fair criticism. There are some unrealistic elements to her character, but I still really enjoyed the books, and this one I ended up giving 5 stars to, primarily because it was just so nostalgic to read it again, and I really enjoyed it. There also is a recipe in this book that I really want to try to find. At one point, the housekeeper, Hannah Gruen, who has helped raise Nancy, makes cinnamon cake and serves it with hot applesauce, and that's a combination I've never tried before, and it just sounds really good. So I am on the hunt now for a cinnamon cake recipe. I don't think I've ever made a cinnamon cake. I have made applesauce though. I also read another Nancy Drew book in the month of January. My goal was to read about one a week because 52 weeks in a year, 56 books in the series, it would just kind of work out if I read one most weeks and then some weeks read two. I ended up only reading two this month, so I'll have to catch up a little bit if I want to stick with it. And I'm giving myself space and permission to not stick with it if I just get bored of them. But for now, I am enjoying reading them again. The second book I ended up giving 3 stars, and part of the reason is that the title is a spoiler and I felt like there were a lot more unrealistic elements in this particular book than there were in the first book. The first book kind of lets you start getting to know Nancy and how she works on mysteries, and in the second book, she's a little bit more independent to the point that it just isn't realistic. And when you're young, that's okay sometimes because you can suspend disbelief or things just seem a lot more possible when you're younger. But as an adult, I can recognize that there are places in this story where adults would have acted differently, or where an adult wouldn't be relying on a teenager to help them with something. So there were some things in this one that I felt were just a little bit less realistic, but the story was still enjoyable and I ended up giving it 3 stars. Another book I read in the month of January was Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is my Penguin Clothbound Classics edition of it. It's a pretty short, quick read. You could get through it in a couple of hours if you wanted to. The thing that stuck with me about this book is that it was kind of harrowing and poignant and slightly terrifying because it is so masterfully done that you can see the parallels between what is going on in this animal world, this barnyard, and what happens in real life, and just kind of drawing those connections was slightly unnerving. But I ended up giving this one 5 stars. I can see why people love it so much. Then I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I have a whole video talking through my thoughts on this book. I didn't expect to like it. I did end up really enjoying it, and in that video I mentioned that I was kind of sitting between a 3.5 or a 3.75 and a 4-star rating, and that I hadn't rated it yet. I think I'm going to end up giving this a 4-star rating because I did enjoy the story, even though I had some issues with it. But overall, it was a book that I can see why people are talking about it so much, and I did enjoy the story. It very much pulled me in. After I read Fourth Wing, I read Iron Flame, and Iron Flame was a different reading experience for me than Fourth Wing was. Fourth Wing pulled me right in and I could not put the book down. I stayed up till 2 a.m. reading it. I was reading it in the car, on my e-reader. I was so engrossed in the story. Iron Flame I picked up and then got a little bit bored and put it down and reached for another book. And I found that I was consistently reaching for other books instead of this one after I had made it 20% of the way through the story. So for example, one night I was reading The Count of Monte Cristo and I had planned on only reading 20 pages of that so that I could stay on track with a book club. And I ended up reading over 100 pages in The Count of Monte Cristo instead because I felt like the writing was just so good and the story was pulling me in, and I wanted to read that more than I wanted to jump back into this one. And I ended up finishing this one around midnight on January 31st. So I really put it off until the very last minute finishing this book. And once I did get back into it, the story pulled me along, but it was a lot more put downable. And I ended up only giving this one 3 stars. There were some elements of the story in this one that I just didn't like as much. The print quality on this one is just kind of disappointing, to be honest. The paper was cut, I think, with a dull blade or something because the paper edges are shedding. The ink was coming off on my fingers whenever I would read it, so my fingers would turn black. And this isn't one with sprayed edges. It was like the text on the inside of the book block was bleeding a little bit onto my fingers. So that's the only book that's ever happened to me with, so I just wasn't as pleased with the print quality. I felt that there were parts of this one that were a lot more skimmable. It's a series that I probably will continue to read because I do want to see what happens next. This one does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, kind of like the last one did, but not as drastic of one. Kind of in the middle on this one. Then I read a book called Night Work by Nora Roberts. It's about a male main character who is a thief, and we follow him through his life from when he's a child and he starts stealing from people to well into adulthood. And what I enjoyed about this story is that it was written about a character, an anti-hero really, that isn't the type of character I'm normally reading about in the kinds of books I read. So it was different. There was a bit of a different perspective, and I did think it was cool that we got to see Harry when he was a child and the circumstances that led him to becoming a thief, and then see him kind of grow up and go to college and become an adult and get into all kinds of situations as an adult. I did find that element of the book quite entertaining, but I also felt like about a third of the book could have been cut out without losing anything from the story. The pace was quite leisurely, which is fine, but a lot of the scenes that were added felt like they weren't moving the plot along at all, or were very repetitive. So the same thing would be happening in this season of his life, and then we see it happening again, and there's not really much difference between the two, and so it felt like we didn't need both. I also thought that the ending wrapped up a little bit too tidily to be realistic. Overall, I ended up giving it 3 stars. There were elements of the book that were really enjoyable to read and others that were very skimmable. I also listened to an audiobook called The Lonely Search for God by Henry Nouwen. I was pronouncing his name Henry Nouwen or Henri Nouwen in earlier videos, and I have since learned that his name is pronounced Nouwen, Henry Nouwen. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I did enjoy it, and the more Henry Nouwen that I'm reading, the more I'm realizing that I would really like to read more of his writings. He has quite a collection of books available, and I would like to read more of them. Then I read Inspired, Slaying Giants, Walking on Water, and Loving the Bible Again by Rachel Held Evans. I've really been enjoying Rachel's writings the last few years. She has passed away since writing her books, but I found them maybe 2 years ago, and I read one and really liked it and thought I'm going to buy more of her books. So I think I own almost all of them now. I've just been kind of slowly picking them up when I can, and this is the one that I read this month. What I love about Rachel is that she's so authentic and honest in her writing, and she's not afraid to call out perspectives that are kind of messed up or explore them for herself with authenticity. She's just a very genuine writer, a genuine human. I wish I could have known her. I wish she was still writing. Everything I read by her just makes me want to read more of her books. So this one I ended up giving 5 stars. Then I read a couple of ebooks. The first was Two Wrongs Make a Right, which is the first book in the Wilmot Sisters series by Chloe Leese. I found this book through my library when I was looking for books by autistic authors or that featured autistic female main characters, and the heroine in this book is autistic. I liked the characters in this book. I felt that the female main character was fairly well developed, and I thought that the love interest was written in such a way that he was very much just perfect for her. But I did think that the last quarter of the book or so wasn't as strong. I felt that some of the issues that were thrown into the book kind of weakened the story a little bit, and so I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Then I read Hello Stranger by Catherine Center, and I rated this one at 3.75 stars, rounded up to 4 on Goodreads. This one's about a woman who ends up having an accident and she loses her ability to see faces. So she is dealing with face blindness throughout the story, and the story itself was very enjoyable. I feel like Catherine Center's books are generally quite enjoyable reads. They're light and fluffy and funny. Her wit comes through in her writing and is just delightful. The characters are generally likable, but the story is very predictable. So if you're somebody who can usually see where a book is going fairly early on in the story, you'll probably find that that is the case for you with this book, but it's still an enjoyable, lighthearted read. Then I read Succeeding with Adult ADHD by Abigail Lavrini, and this is one that I picked up. I think I showed it in a recent haul video. I have been on a quest for the last over a year now to try to find books about adult ADHD that aren't off-putting or condescending and that are genuinely helpful. Something that I find with a lot of books about ADHD is that the ADHD symptoms presented, or the manifestation of ADHD that's presented, is a very stereotypical male adolescent depiction of ADHD. And as an adult diagnosed woman, I just don't relate to the lived experiences of young white boys. And so what I'm finding is a lot of the books that are written by men, I just don't relate to at all. A lot of them feel very condescending. Other ones just feel like they're really not helpful at all. There's nothing in there that's helpful. And then the other thing I'm coming across is that because I was diagnosed as an adult, I've already figured out a lot of my coping mechanisms, or the things that work for me to stay on track and get things done and function as an adult in a capitalistic society. And so when a book is just presenting those things, I've already figured those out for myself. I don't need a book to tell me about them. And so they end up not being as useful for me, although I could see how they could be useful for a younger person who's still just trying to figure out how their brain works. But anyway, so those are the problems that I have with some of the books I've already read about adult ADHD or just ADHD in general. This one I ended up giving 4 stars to. I felt like it was better than a lot of the other ones that I have read, and I did feel that there were some helpful suggestions presented throughout the book. I did find that the most helpful ones were ones I've already figured out for myself. So I didn't feel like it really added much to my personal repertoire, but I did feel that the book itself was a lot better than the other ones I've read so far. So I ended up giving it 4 stars. Then I read another ebook. This one was called Full Measures by Rebecca Yarros. It's the first book in the Flight and Glory series. I picked up this one because it's written by Rebecca Yarros, who wrote Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and I was curious about what her writing would be like in other genres aside from romantasy, so I picked up this one from the library so I could see. And it's about a girl who has been walking through grief, and somebody that she used to know has walked back into her life and is showing up for her as she's grieving a loss. I ended up giving this book a 2-star rating. It just wasn't for me, I think. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't think that the plot was well developed. I did think, as someone who has lost someone very close to me, that the grief elements were pretty well written, but I felt that the romance wasn't well developed. It was so focused on the physical that you really don't see their relationship actually grow much at all, and so I didn't really like the story for that reason. I don't mind spice in books if it's not a distraction or if it isn't just like filler, but it felt like filler in this one. It felt like there wasn't enough happening to actually show the growth of the main character's relationship. So I didn't enjoy it as much. Then I read 3 books in a series on Kindle Unlimited. It's the Crowns series by Nicola Tyche, I want to say, Tyche. And the 3 books in that series are North Queen, Shadow Queen, and War Queen. I think that this series would appeal to people who've finished reading Fourth Wing and want something that kind of pulls you into the story like Fourth Wing does. Without giving away any spoilers, because I don't want to ruin the story for you, the series is about a woman who has lost her memories and doesn't know that she's a princess. She wakes up far away from home and is brought back to the kingdom where she is set to reign, and has to kind of jump back into a life she doesn't remember with people she doesn't remember knowing. And she has to kind of navigate all of this and navigate the politics of being at war with other countries, but she can't remember anything about why her country is at war, etc. And so she's getting all of this information from people she just has to choose to trust or not trust while she's trying to recover her memory. And it's a very well-developed story. I felt like the first book was the strongest of the 3. I ended up giving that one 3.5 stars, rounded up to 4 on Goodreads. I felt that it just pulls you into the story and you want to keep reading. It is a bit gory and gruesome throughout the series, so if that's something that you don't find appealing, you'll probably end up skimming a little bit. I skimmed some of the gorier scenes, but the story is very engaging and well written. The characters are very well developed over the whole trilogy, and it was an enjoyable read. The first book was the one I liked the best. I think my rating went down a little bit with each one. So the second book I gave a 3-star rating to, and the third book I just didn't really like. I think I gave it 1.5 stars, rounded up to 2 on Goodreads. It just wasn't my favorite one of the 3, but each book did make me want to keep reading. The first book is very much a slow burn in the romance elements, and then the second book kind of kicks right off with a very different kind of romantic relationship, in that the relationship between the characters has changed, and so there's a lot more spice in the second book. And then the third book also has quite a bit of spice, so if that's something you don't like in books, you might not enjoy this series as much. But the first book at least is very good. I would recommend reading that one if the plotline kind of appeals to you and you think it might be a good fit, so you could see if you want to keep reading. All 3 books in that trilogy are available on Kindle Unlimited. So those are the books that I finished in the month of January. I also have a few that I'm still reading, so I'm carrying them over into February. The first is Savor by Shauna Niequist. This is a daily kind of devotional book that has 365 entries in it. I'm buddy reading this with my gran right now. We like to buddy read a book or 2 throughout the year, and usually we're reading something like this where we just have a short daily entry that we each read and then we can talk about it. What I like about this one is that there are recipes scattered throughout, so about once a month we each make the recipe and then have a FaceTime call where we talk about it and enjoy the food. And so it's been kind of fun to mix that cooking element and baking into our daily reading. It's something that I've really enjoyed doing with her. Then I'm carrying over The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is the Penguin Clothbound Classics edition, but if you know those editions, you know that the embossing kind of tends to rub off on those. So I keep mine, when I'm reading them, in protective cloth covers to kind of keep that from happening as much as possible. And then the other main one I'm carrying over is The Wisdom of Your Body by Dr. Hilary McBride. This is one that I'm really enjoying. I'm probably about 40% of the way through it right now, and I'm finding it very good. I think this is an alternative cover because the cover I see most on Goodreads is blue, and I think I got this one from Book Outlet. So it may have been like a cover they decided not to go with, or a cover that was printed in a different country or something. I'm not sure, but I'm noticing that other people's books have a different cover than I have, so not sure what's happening there, but the book is really good. I'm hoping to finish this one in February. Then I have 2 others that I'm carrying over into February. The first is Writing Picture Books by Anne Whitford Paul. I've only read the first chapter in this one so far, just to see if it was one that I wanted to read in February, and it is, so I'm carrying that one over. And then I'm still working my way very slowly through Pride and Prejudice for that project that I've mentioned before. That is my January reading wrap-up. I'd love to hear what your favorite book that you read in January was, or the book you gave the highest rating to. And I'd also love to hear what your last 5-star book was. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!